the greater the dispersion, as a statistician would say, of the income scale, the greater the risk there is of being, of being left behind. And the greater the risk there is of being left behind, the more UC can charge, especially if students can borrow. But if incomes become increasingly unequal, how can eligible students afford the higher price? Well, the model assumes, one, that selectivity remains the same, that they don't lower their admission standard, otherwise it wouldn't be worth it, and two, it assumes that every admitted student can simply increase their debt by the amount of tuition increases. And third, they assume that a student's propensity to do that, a propensity to borrow, actually grows as income gaps grow. And insofar as other students are willing to pay, it grows as tuition rises. So based on these assumptions, the assumption that you can borrow, the higher ratio, higher tuition, is, according to UC's theory, simply a way of raising more money by moving every student, the median student, to a higher point along a debt equity ratio. In other words, tuition is simply the discount you get for paying up front. And if it takes you a lifetime to pay, the debt is simply the compound interest. And if demand isn't affected as income inequality increases, all that happens is that you move to the point where you have a higher ratio of debt to equity. That is, in other words, simply their theory. What tuition does is to allow increasing the tuition-funded plan is to allow increasing income inequality combined with increasing availability of capital to finance UC revenue growth. And in fact, UC privatization is at its core the policy of tapping its ability to confer borrowing power on you as its only bankable source of revenue growth. That's the plan. That's the theory. From an accounting point of view, from a Wall Street point of view, this source of revenue is completely different from state appropriations. From a Wall Street point of view, as I said in some of my earlier pieces, tuition revenue is simply capital that can be invested. It can be used to leverage other areas that the university wants to subsidize, such as corporate partnerships. It can be used to leverage construction. UC is building an entire new campus for the University of California at San Francisco in Mission Bay. How is it doing that? It's doing that by leveraging its growing borrowing power. And what is its growing borrowing power? It is its power to raise tuition. In other words, UC can tell credit markets, we can raise tuition and enrollments as much as we want in a way that the state cannot when it comes to raising taxes as much as it wants. Famously. It does this. It raises tuition because it is its major source of capital, even as it cuts educational quality. UC, in other words, grows on the back of tuition. It spends money and incurs costs, but cost per credit hour, that is to say the cost of a marginal extra hour of instruction, continues to go down and go down and go down in UC. And nobody thinks that restored state funding will ever restore cost per credit hour unless you demand it. The single biggest fallacy in last fall's debate about tuition is that UC has been forced to raise tuition because the taxpayer won't pay. I want to persuade you today, I want you to at least come out thinking it's possible I'm right, that UC wants to raise tuition regardless of how much the state pays. Why? Because it can. and it's more money that it can treat as capital and use in any way it likes. Whether or not the state pays may determine when UC raises tuition. It may determine how fast it raises tuition, because it will use state budget cuts as a basis for making instructional cuts, and it will use the instructional cuts as a reason why you should be willing to pay more, not to reverse the instructional cuts, but because they're threatening to make them even worse. You know they're never going to get reversed. But it's also interesting that if you take this theory, the financial theory I'm presenting seriously, there's another dot you can connect, something you already know. It's not so much that UC is raising tuition because the taxpayers won't pay. Why won't the taxpayers pay? Because UC's reason for raising tuition is to persuade those of you who pay tuition that they are leaving most taxpayers in California behind economically. So why should they pay? Why should taxpayers who've been left behind pay for a system of higher education that now justifies higher tuition, not because it is an engine of economic equality in the state, but because it is an engine of economic inequality in the state? In other words, the explicit reason that UC gives you to make you borrow more also functions as an implicit reason why taxpayers who don't go to UC should refuse to pay more for it. So what about the argument? What about the argument that UC's costs simply go up? Well, yes, they go up. But they don't go up, as you well know, because UC is spending more per credit hour on instruction, because the marginal cost per credit hour is increasing. That's the only place, cost per credit hour is the only place where UC really economizes. It knows how to economize. It economizes on your back. It economizes partly because the instructional cuts are a way to persuade you to pay in order to avoid more instructional cuts. And also because UC simply says none of anyone's business. It's not accountable for how it uses any of the $6 billion in carry-forwards that it saved by not spending all the instructional money it got in previous years. That's its own money. It spiked the ball. Let's see what the state will pay next year. UC's costs go up because its non-instructional costs are rising. And they are rising in part because it can cover those non-instructional costs by increasing enrollments and increasing tuition on those enrollments, and then in part because other universities can do likewise and it needs to compete with them. So yes, higher ed costs do rise, but universities could not incur these escalating costs if they could not raise prices, and they could not raise prices if students could not borrow on private credit markets. Everything that I've said is stuff you already know. You just have to connect the dots. You just have to connect the dots. So how does UC then use enrollment-generated funds, even while its actual cost per credit hour falls? The short answer is that they use these funds in any way they like. That is to say, to subsidize whatever activities UC administrators choose to make a priority. A few of you may have seen some articles I wrote in the fall about how they use this money to leverage and subsidize construction projects. Have fees actually been used for this purpose? Well, they've been pledged, they could have been used, they would have been used. The answer to my fall articles is that UC admits that using tuition to subsidize construction would be wrong. They admit that it would be wrong, which is why they don't keep records of whether they're doing it or not. They have no records for any of the 479 bond-funded projects that they could fund using permission tuition, because it would be wrong. So really, they're citing their policy against doing this as proof that they couldn't be violating their policy because, hey, it's their policy. It's like being caught robbing a bank and being told I couldn't be robbing a bank because that would be illegal.